The Poles hoped that they would only have to hold out for a few days, that their Soviet allies just across the Vistula River would come to their aid. But the guns of the Red Army had fallen silent.
And all of a sudden, dead silence. I said, what happened? Where are they? Why aren't they fighting?
At this point, the Germans took back the initiative. Their goal? To cut an artery through the center of Warsaw to the river. The fiercest battle raged in the Old Town.
Medieval streets, narrow corners, ideal cover for snipers and the underground fighters, took the Germans a month to capture.
600 underground companies, 50 to 100 soldiers each, fanned out, each with a street or building to defend. When they lacked weapons, they fought with stones or bricks. And through it all, a remarkable underground support system. Bakeries in basements. Factories turning out grenades. Even underground newspapers. Hospitals were set up in cellars and moved from building to building to escape the German bombs.
And this is all your neighborhood. Imagine that. Your neighborhood turning to rubble. And you still refuse to give up. And you look at the sky and you say to yourself, oh, the Americans are coming. The Americans are coming because they're fighting for the same thing.
But among the Allies, a different kind of battle was going on. The RAF had flown some airdrops to aid Warsaw, but too many planes were shot down. The US wanted to send high-flying, heavy bombers flying fortresses that could evade German anti-aircraft fire. But the planes would have to land in Soviet-controlled territory to refuel. In a series of historic telegrams, the US asked Stalin for permission to land. Stalin refused.
They not only watched the Nazis massacre the insurgents and kill a lot of the civilian population, but they prevented for many weeks us, the Americans and the Brits, from delivering help to the insurgents.
Stalin had his own plans for Central Europe when the war was over, and an independent Polish government wasn't part of it.
The fact of the matter is that Stalin did not want to see Warsaw liberated by the Poles. He would prefer to see it smashed.
The Soviet refusal launched a crescendo of telegrams between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. August 20th, Churchill and Roosevelt send a joint message to Stalin urging him to let their planes land. August 22nd, Stalin responds with a denunciation of the handful of criminals in Warsaw. August 25th, Churchill asks Roosevelt to join him in another impassioned plea to Stalin. To Roosevelt, he proposes to send the planes and see what happens. It is at this moment that Roosevelt makes a fateful decision. August 26th, Roosevelt to Churchill. I do not consider it advantageous to the long-range general war prospect for me to join you in the proposed message to Uncle Joe.
Roosevelt's refusal to act is probably the key political moment in the Rising. The Western Allies had a lot of cards they could have played. They were supplying the Soviet Union with colossal amounts of transport, ammunition, military supplies, and if the president had intervened, he may well have had a response. They never even tried it.
Whether the effort would have succeeded, whether Stalin would have backed down, we'll never know. What we do know is that Roosevelt wouldn't even support Churchill in some half-hearted efforts to put pressure on Stalin.
But Roosevelt was preoccupied with beating the Nazis on the Western Front, and he knew that the Soviets had so far borne the brunt of the battle against the Germans. He did not want to risk losing them.
This is very much on Roosevelt's mind, that he cannot really afford to antagonize the Soviet Union in any way. The basic strategy of the United States was to fight a war of attrition where most of the attriting would be done by the Soviets. And indeed, the Second World War took over 20 million Soviet lives, took fewer than 500,000 American lives.
Later historians would call Stalin's refusal to help the Poles a gauntlet thrown down before the West.
When Stalin sensed that there wasn't really too much pressure from Roosevelt, from Churchill, I suspect he simply became more brazen.
In late August, news of the Allied liberation of Paris reached Warsaw. To the desperate Poles, it was bittersweet.
We were very happy on one hand and feeling alone on the other. And we were really beginning to understand that we are left alone and that we are not going to win.
The battle for the Old Town took 33 days. One building changed hands 7 times.
The battle went from street to street, from house to house, from floor to floor, day and night.
At the peak of the battle, German bombers arrived every 40 minutes. Casualties were enormous. Many Polish units lost 80% of their soldiers.
There was no way of surrendering. They would murder you. They would not take prisoners.
There wasn't much sleep, there wasn't much food, and slowly there was not much hope.
Facing obliteration, underground commanders decided to evacuate the Old Town to get to the city center for a last stand. Their only method of escape, the sewers.
Yes, the sewers was an extraordinary story. It became an everyday occurrence of thousands of people moving under German positions very often.
For 5 days, underground units staged diversionary attacks to distract the enemy. Meanwhile, directly underneath them, thousands of unseen men and women were escaping through the sewers. The last group just 50 yards ahead of the oncoming Germans.
What I saw in front of me for 6 hours was the behind of the man in front of me. We had constantly moved. If somebody would fail to move or pass out or die from exhaustion, we would be there bottled up for the rest of our life.
The Germans tried to stop it by dropping grenades and gas canisters, and quite a lot of people were killed in the sewers.
Several thousand made it through to the city center. Throughout the slaughter, the Soviets remained on the sidelines, except for an attempt in mid-September to cross the Vistula River by a Polish unit under Soviet command. It was brief, unsuccessful, and never repeated. What's more, the underground was receiving disturbing reports that outside Warsaw, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, were actually arresting their soldiers.
Some of them shot, others shipped to the Gulag. The NKVD was staging Nazi-like hunts, chasing the underground in all the provinces the Soviets were taking over.
From the Soviet point of view, they were not just anti-Nazi fighters, which they were. And they were people who wanted an independent Poland. That made them objectively, in Soviet eyes, anti-Soviet. So they would destroy them, and they did.
And those reports were getting back to London and Washington, were they not?
Yes, and they were disregarded.
Because they were...
Politically inconvenient.
And the underground was having difficulty getting London to believe their desperate situation. And this is an ID document. Sofia Gorbonsky
Yes.
was a decoder for the underground radio.
Passport or something.
You were giving them reports.
Every day,
You were telling them the fight was still going on.
everywhere, every day, 18 hours a day.
On September 1st, the 5th anniversary of the German invasion of Poland, with thousands of his people dying in the streets of Warsaw, the exiled Polish commander-in-chief abandoned diplomacy, writing an open letter in London newspapers. Warsaw is not waiting for empty words of praise, not for assurances of sympathy. Warsaw is waiting for weapons and ammunition. September 18th, 1944 was a beautiful day in Warsaw. The sun was shining. Suddenly, in the sky, a miracle.
That was the most wonderful picture when the American planes came, and they were very, very high, so you didn't see anything. You just heard this, these heavy bombers. And then all of a sudden there was like flowers. The parachutes were multicolored,
The Soviets had finally relented. U.S. flying fortresses had been granted clearance for a mission to aid Warsaw. It was a spark of hope, but a false one. It was the one and only American mission the Soviets would clear. By now, the Polish resistance had been reduced to 3 shrinking pockets. In one of them, Mokotów, the insurgents, under a torrent of artillery and bombardment, were driven into a block of barricaded streets.
We were totally exhausted. We were starving. We had no ammunition.
We were going to go to the center of the city, which was still in Polish hands. And the only way we could do it was to go through the sewers.
So began a trek that was truly a descent into hell. Civilians and soldiers alike crowded into the sewers.
Many of them became psychotic, paranoid. They were screaming. There was dead bodies of people who exhausted and gave up or died or even committed suicide because they could not carry on.
For 20 hours, men and women walked in a river of human waste, sometimes up to their chests.
And I think that I sort of imposed upon myself not to think, don't think, because you will not make it, I think that one thing that saved me from losing my mind was that I had an illusion of a light at the end. And then suddenly I realized there is a stream of light was coming down through the manhole, and suddenly I was the next one. Somebody grabbed me under my arms and put me down, put me on my feet.
Christine Yaroshevich made it, but went blind for 3 days from the fumes of the sewers. Janusz Belza also survived after watching many others die.
After all these hours, and feeling that you arrive into kind of a safe area and the helping hands to getting you out.
While the remaining insurgents converged on the city center, to the west, the Germans were arresting and shooting underground survivors. Shockingly, to the east, the Soviets, supposed allies of the Poles, were doing the same thing. Reports of Soviet behavior were, finally, getting out.